Hi, my topic that I will be discussing today is code switching and code mixing. I realize this is a broad topic, so I wanted to mainly look into how it develops in children and all the factors and influences that entails, but I was also interested in if there were differences in development of code switching when it came to immigrant versus heritage language speakers. Some of the questions I was interested in researching were how soon do children start code switching, and how do language policies, schools, and society affect this? Do children code mix before code switching, and are they aware of what they're doing? Does code mixing or switching develop differently in children who are bilingual than those who are monolingual but speak a quote unquote non-standard dialect? And what influences affect the development of this, and how does this affect their language usage? And how does race, culture, socioeconomic status, and other outside influences come into play? And does it develop differently in immigrants that have English as a second language than those that are heritage speakers born into the society of a different dominant language? First, I wanted to go over some of the definitions of code switching, mixing, and meshing. Code switching is alternating between two or more languages or language varieties or dialects in the context of a single conversation, using elements of more than one language when conversing in a manner that is consistent with the syntax, morphology, and phonology of each language or dialect. Usually, this will look like switching between two ways of talking in whole sentences or phrases. Code mixing is the hybridization of two languages, so this is where you might see a random English word thrown in a Spanish sentence. Code meshing is the happy medium of the two and is an instructional approach that invites multiple languages and language varieties within the classroom. This is where you might see a teacher use AAVE instead of SAE to explain a concept to students, whilst maybe teaching a concept that pertains to standard American English. Now that we know the definitions, we should probably start at the beginning and see just when code switching starts to develop. This depends on a couple factors. If the child is code switching between two different languages, such as English and Spanish, then the child may start code mixing around 31 months and code switching closer to around 3 years of age once they start creating more multi-word simple sentences. As for children that are code switching between one language but two different dialects, such as Standard American English and AAVE, this usually happens a bit later. We usually don't see this develop until around elementary school. So, does code mixing or switching develop differently in children who are bilingual than those that are monolingual? As I kind of already went over, yes, for children that are bilingual, code mixing will develop before code switching, as they will go through the general acquisition process for both languages at the same time, following the stages of like cooing, babbling, one-word stage, two-word stage, and then telegraphic speech. Roughly around the two-word and telegraphic speech stage, the bilingual children will start to code mix, and as they begin developing their language skills more and creating sentences, they start to code switch between the languages. As for the code switching development in the monolingual dialect speakers, they don't usually develop a quote unquote need for switching until they enter elementary school and they are exposed to standard American English. There are some cases where they might be exposed to the standard American English earlier in other environments, such as daycare or even just traveling outside their community. But generally speaking, as the child is more exposed to standard American English, and especially in school settings that tend to correct the children when using anything other than standard American English, this is when the external factors influence the distinction between their home dialect and standard American English, thus influencing the switching. So, why do people code switch? This can be complex, but to put it simply, for children that are switching between two languages, it is mainly a communicative reason in that they are trying to convey something from one language to another. When it comes to switching between dialects, this mainly develops because of a societal factors and stigma. There are many different factors that influence code switching, but there are three main ones that studies tend to look at. Structural linguistic characteristics of the two languages, so how Spanish and French have gender markings for nouns, but English doesn't. Internal psycholinguistic factors such as motivation and learning styles, and external social factors such as age, class, gender, race, etc. Previous studies have looked at many factors that contribute to the development and use of code switching in children. Some factors are, of course, language proficiency. The language that the child is more proficient in is the language the child will gravitate to code switch into from the other. Of course, when there are no translation equivalencies, children will code switch. And generally speaking, the language the child is exposed to more often is the language that they tend to borrow from when code switching. There have also been several studies that have shown more code switching in minority relative to majority languages, such that children borrow more majority language words in a non-majority language context than the reverse. One study that I found that it's interesting to look into that acknowledges these past studies findings, but looks into some differences in environment and language policies, as far as official language status goes at least, is a study called Code Switching in Young Bilingual Toddlers, a longitudinal cross-language investigation. This study looks at two groups of bilingual children, Spanish-English children in San Diego and French English children in Montreal. In the United States, English is the majority language and the language of the higher prestige. Despite this, in San Diego, California, 25% of children 5 years and older speak or hear Spanish in the home. In contrast, in Montreal, Quebec, where French is the official language, 59% of children 5 years or older speak both French and English. This study looked to see if these environments and exposure affected what they referred to as intersentient and intrasentential code switching. Intrasentential being more like code switching, where the child switches languages at phrases or sentence boundaries, and intrasentential being more like code mixing, in that mid-sentence the child might change languages for certain words or morphemes for sentence structure. How do language policy, schools, and society affect code switching? We've kind of gone over a lot of this kind of stuff in class. There's many different aspects, such as like the policing of dialects in favor of standard American English in school, employers thinking that it's more professional for you to talk in standard American English. There's a bunch of like racial and ethnic things, whereas like if you talk a certain way, then you might be looked down upon in your community. But at work, if you talk that same way that you would with your community, you'll be looked at kind of weird. A bunch of the policies and stuff where you can't teach in anything but standard American English and how it's more frowned upon to teach in anything but that is also kind of affecting whether you will see more code switching in that school environment outside of the classroom as well as in the home. So does code switching develop differently in immigrants that have English as a second language than those that are heritage speakers born into the society of a different dominant language? Looking at the difference in code switching in second language learners and heritage speakers, there is development differences, but not by means that I was initially looking for or expecting. Immigrant second language speakers tend to have more negative attitude toward code switching, and the thought of using and the idea of biculturalism is seen as negative, so this hesitation of losing their culture and language tend to lead to these second language learners not having a fleshed out development of code switching. Heritage speakers, on the other hand, tend to develop this code switching a bit more naturally, especially amongst other heritage speakers. Heritage speakers develop more of a knack for switching, and the switching and biculturalism almost becomes a part of their identity and a means in which they embrace two things at once instead of putting one over the other. Uh, these hesitations to code switching are not unwarranted, though, as there are some impacts of code switching that are not favorable, as this constant flipping between languages, dialects, and subsequently cultures can lead to identity confusion and a lack of feeling of belonging, which can have consequences such as cognitive fatigue and burnout. Overall, code switching has its pros and cons, and its development is varied depending on circumstances and the individual themselves. There are lots of things I'm still looking into researching more to get more details so that I can better understand the multifaceted development of code switching. But overall, we all kind of know that society will impact everything, and whether you code switch at home or code switch in the workplace, it's going to all depend on who you're around, and even as simple as language and the kind of languages that you're exposed to. when you're growing up and even in the environment around you. And I have a bunch of stuff I'm looking into still with a bunch of long and tedious stuff to look into as far as research papers and stuff to look at. But yeah, thank you for listening.